Hello everyone, how's it going? I come to you from a new location. I'm gonna get to that towards the end of the video. It's been a couple weeks since I've made a video, and I'm gonna also get to that at the end of the video. Anyway, I wanted to make a reading update of what I am currently reading. There are a few books that I have finished in the past couple weeks, but they're kind of distant by this point, a bit too distant for me to, I think, have much of a desire to talk about them. And most of them either were books that I won't have that much to say about, that's very interesting, or books that disappointed me, and so I'm just disinclined to go back and talk about them since they disappointed me. Just because I would rather talk about books that I like and that I'm finding interesting at the moment, rather than talk about my disappointments. To start with, I am reading The Metaphysical Poets. This is a Penguin Classics edition, edited by Helen Gardner, who I know edited the Oxford Book of English Verse, so she has chops. And it has an introduction by her as well, which I haven't read yet. I'm gonna read the introduction after I've read all the poems, because sometimes, just because in this case, for some reason, I feel like maybe having read the poems, will make the introduction more, help me get more out of the introduction than if I read it first. But I don't know. I also just wanted to get right to the poems. Now, the Metaphysical Poets are a school of 17th century English poets who weren't really a formal school at the time that they were alive and writing. They were kind of all lumped together after the fact by 20th century critics. According to Wikipedia, their work was characterized by the inventive use of conceits and by a greater emphasis on the spoken rather than lyrical quality of their verse. Conceits, my understanding of a conceit is an extensive metaphor, essentially, where the object of the metaphor doesn't necessarily have that much to do with what it's representing. It's more interesting in its inventiveness than in its necessarily relevance to what it's representing. So anyway, the sense I'm getting so far is that the Metaphysical Poets are very kind of philosophical, in a sense, and perhaps a bit mystical, almost. A lot of the poems seem to have this mystical quality of becoming one with nature or one with God, I suppose, in the case of these poets, because a lot of them were religious poets. It's funny, because I started out this month wanting to read the poetry of John Donne, and I kind of fell out of that. But the thing is that the John Donne was one of the primary poets of the metaphysical school, and so there's a huge section of his poems in here. And so I'm currently working on that section. I'm not that far in. I'm hoping to finish the John Donne section today, which will take me to almost page 100 of about 300 pages. It's kind of making me regret stopping reading John Donne's poetry, because I'm really liking his poems. A lot of his love poems are actually in here. It's interesting on that subject. Sorry, the cat just jumped over. I never thought I would like love poems, ever. I just had forever said that they weren't really my thing. But I'm really liking John Donne's love poetry. I don't know, there's something, I think, mystical about it in a sense, but also, like, in a sense that almost you're becoming one with the other person you're in love with, but it also seems to have this undercurrent within it that acknowledges the transience of that relationship and that oneness, I suppose, you get with a lover, which I find a lot more compelling than most love poetry. So yeah, I'm quite liking the John Donne poetry in here, and the other poetry. So Metaphysical Poets, that is one book I'm reading. The next book I'm reading is as a buddy read with Elena Macredina. I've been saying her name Macredina, but everyone else says it Macredina, so tell me, Elena, is it Macredina, if you're watching? We are buddy reading The Metamorphoses by Ovid this month, And this is a long narrative poem that is kind of a collection of Greek and Roman myths. Ovid was a Roman poet who lived from late in the before Christ era to very early into the after Christ era of the human timeline, or if you want to use the more modern terminology, the before the Common Era and then the Common Era. But anyway, he's a Roman poet, and it's a long narrative poem. It's a collection of stories of Greek and Roman myths, and he takes some artistic license to make them a bit more fun and dramatic. And but anyway, I'm going to be making an entire video about Ovid's Metamorphoses for our buddy read, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. But just a few notes, just a couple notes. I am really enjoying being back in Ovid's world. I read Ovid's Metamorphoses last year, so this is a reread, but it was a different translation. But I'm really enjoying the stories again, possibly even more on the second time. And this translation is beautiful. This is the Horace Gregory translation, which is the one that I've gotten recommended by multiple places. And it's wonderful. It's beautiful as a work of English poetry in its own right. And yeah, so I'm really liking this, but not going to talk too much more about it because I'm going to make a whole video about it. So anyway, next is something a bit heavier, an Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding by David Hume. This is my second book by David Hume, and this is primarily about the philosophy of science, and also sort of about psychology and how humans tend to acquire knowledge. He discusses a lot in this book the induction fallacy. So there's this distinction between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. I'm by no means an expert on epistemology, but this is just my understanding, that deductive reasoning is something you can reason out using sort of logic. You can know beforehand what's going to happen or what something is. So you know that 2 plus 1 equals 3 just because 2 and 1, when you add them together, equal 3. And you can show that with a sort of logical proof. And the logical proof is just, 2 plus 1 equals 3. So it's something you can know beforehand what an outcome will be or what something is. But inductive reasoning is where you sort of need to have experience with something. So, if I have been dropped onto the world with no knowledge whatsoever of how the world works, I may not realize that the sun sets and that it rises again the next day. When the sun sets on my first day, I may despair, thinking it's never going to come back. But lo and behold, 10 hours later it will rise, and I will realize after a few days that the sun tends to set and then rise again. And that's inductive reasoning, where you kind of use the past to predict the future, in a sense. And that's the kind of reasoning that science is based on, because in science, you do an experiment and see the result, and you kind of assume that the future will be predicted by the past, in the sense that that experiment, when similar conditions that you created in that experiment are present in the real world, then the outcome in the real world will tend to align with the outcome of that experiment. And so that's like inductive reasoning, because those experiments you do are those past experiences that you use to then predict the future, just like we use our past experience of the fact that the sun does tend to rise in the morning to predict that it will rise tomorrow morning. But there is a fallacy in that reasoning, because the sun may not rise one morning. It may just happen that the sun explodes one day and the sun doesn't rise. So inductive reasoning is always kind of flawed. But inductive reasoning is also how we tend to gain knowledge about the world. Most things we can't just know through our reasoning or through logical proofs. Most things we have to have experience with and, sort of experiment with a little bit. And that, of course, is how science works. So, anyway, that's basically the big idea in this book, it seems, and it's an idea that I'm familiar with from a lot of my classes. So a lot of this book is just kind of preaching to the crowd for me. Not that I know every idea in it, but I still, despite the fact that I kind of am familiar with the contents of this book, I like to have read these primary sources for these ideas. just because I like to actually be able to cite the real source of something, rather than just to let teachers tell me what something says. So it's kind of a part of my own sort of personal self-education or self-re-education in a sense. So anyway, I'm liking that. David Hume is a very good writer, I think. Again, like with his dialogues concerning natural religion, it is not exactly easy reading, but it's engaging, so it's fun to read, I think. So yeah, anyway, an enquiry concerning human understanding. And lastly, we come to the Bible, which I have been reading. I've been participating in Steve Donahue's Sunday read-along of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. And, I have just yesterday finished the Gospel of Luke, and today I'm hoping to read through the entire Gospel of John. And I'm really enjoying returning to these Gospels now, because when I read them the first time, I was younger. I was a less experienced reader. I wasn't as good a reader. And basically the last time I read these Gospels, I was mainly caught up on why on earth I have to read the same story 4 different times. Why are there 4 different versions of the same story? Why don't we just have one Gospel that is the story of Jesus' life? It's kind of what I thought then. Which, in retrospect, is kind of indicative that I wasn't, of the fact that I wasn't a very sophisticated reader when I read the Gospels. But I'm really liking this second chance at them, because I have sort of started to, when we started this read-along, Steve had said, approach these books like they're just literature, like you just found them in a cave somewhere, and, you were just reading them for their literary merits. And, at first it was hard for me to divorce these from all of their religious significance. But basically what I ended up doing to help me with that is just to focus on the character of Jesus, in each gospel. And that has really helped. And I think the Jesus of Matthew, and Mark a little bit, the Gospel of Mark I kind of, not that it's of course, I don't not count it as a gospel, but I don't regard it as highly as the other gospels. But the Jesus of Matthew I find to be a very compelling character. He's a very complex character, but I think what ultimately makes him interesting to me is that he was a human being who saw what he was fated to endure, like crucifixion, and wanted to face it stoically and bravely, but ended up despairing at the last minute, sort of, because he's human. There are a couple hints that he had sort of last minute, not necessarily doubts about his mission, but at the last minute really despaired of his fate. On the cross he says, "O Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" Even though earlier in the gospel he'd been saying, "This is what's going to happen to me, and then I'm going to rise after 3 days," as though he had accepted it. But when someone cries out, "O Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" while they're being crucified, it kind of suggests that they haven't entirely accepted their fate. Because it turns out it's hard to be crucified. I googled, after I read the first gospel, I googled what being crucified was like, and it is indeed a horrible way to die. So you can't really blame him. But I think that attempt to face his fate stoically was admirable. But the way that he despaired at the last minute was ultimately very human, and that's why I liked him. Ultimately liked him. Well, not entirely like I'd want to know him, but found him compelling anyway. And that aspect of his character, for me, is kind of lost in the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is the most complete narrative, has the most complete narrative out of all of the Gospels. It is complete with an origin story of both John and Jesus. It has a lot more about John the Baptist in it, as well as Jesus. It has just a lot more about Jesus too. But in it, Jesus is kind of finally this God godlike figure, who is just superhuman and performs miracles effortlessly, performs miracles like it's nothing, performs miracles all the time. But also, in the Gospel of Luke, what is absent is his last-minute despair. You know, the Jesus of the Gospel of Luke just faces his destiny like it's nothing and goes for it, and dies and is resurrected. And there's no kind of no hint of human fears, I guess. And so for me, that ultimately made the Jesus of Luke less compelling. As much as I would love to say that, you know, the gospel of my namesake is the best gospel, I actually think I like Matthew better so far. I haven't finished John, obviously, so I don't know. But I was hoping to make videos about each of these gospels, like Elena Macradina is doing, and like, of course, Steve is doing, and like Wilson Shugart is doing. But I haven't really had time or energy to, and that kind of leads me into the whole life update aspect of this video. And so, the new location. I am spending the summer with my parents in New York. So, what happened last week, the reason I didn't really have time or energy to make videos, was because I was moving. So, as I said in a previous video, I am going to be starting at Iowa State's social psychology PhD program in the fall, and I'm going to be moving, obviously, to Ames, Iowa. And so my mom and I moved all of my stuff to a storage locker in Ames, and we're just going to leave it there for the summer. I do have an apartment all set up. I've signed the lease and everything, but the lease doesn't start till August 1st, so I can't move till then. So I'm just going to kind of keep my stuff in a storage locker in Ames for the summer and stay with my parents until August, hence the new location. So yeah, anyway, and that whole process of moving and everything was why I wasn't making videos or anything, and why I wasn't even commenting that much. So anyway, that's sort of the sum total of my life update. It may be harder for me to make videos because I'm in my parents' house and I get self-conscious about making videos while other people might be listening, and even though there are a lot of rooms in my parents' house, sound does tend to travel well in it, and so I will be very particular about when I am willing to film. But we'll see. I am not going to fall off the side of the world, I promise. But anyway, that is my reading update. That is my life update. And anyway, let me know what you all are reading, and let me know if you have thoughts on any of these books. Anyway, thanks all for watching. Bye.